"I've known since the first name on that list," my dad said, and my hands went cold. For months I had traced invoices, phantom warehouses, and payroll changes no one could explain, certain I was the one uncovering the truth alone. 36 employees. My half-brother had planted them inside Dad's company for years, and somehow Dad had watched every single one of them arrive. He knew, and he had never told me why. The folder on the table between me and the board contained evidence of $6.2 million in stolen money, 36 planted employees, and proof that my father had known since the beginning. I sat across from 5 board members in the headquarters conference room, hands flat on polished mahogany to keep them from shaking. The evidence folder, manila, ordinary, devastating, sat closed before me. Invoices, wire transfers, HR records proving systematic fraud spanning 18 months. Every document traced back to approval accounts my father controlled. Harold Garrett sat 2 chairs to my right. 70 years old, founder and chairman of Garrett Steel, the man who'd built this company from a single rented warehouse 45 years ago. His reputation for integrity was as solid as the structural beams we fabricated. He sat with hands folded, face unreadable, waiting for me to begin the presentation he knew would end him. Frank Whitfield, board chair and former Steel executive who'd served 12 years on our board, cleared his throat. "Ms. Garrett, you called this emergency session. The floor is yours." At 38, I'd spent a decade as vice president of operations at my father's company, carrying the pocket watch he'd given me like a promise I intended to keep. I knew every production line, every supplier contract, every employee by name. And now I knew something else. 36 of those names were fiction. My voice came out thin. I stopped, cleared my throat. "Thank you for convening on short notice." Professional, controlled, as if my world wasn't ending. The other board members shifted 2 local business owners, a retired CFO, a bank president, people who'd known my father longer than I'd been alive, people who would have to decide what to do when I opened this folder. How do you destroy the person who built everything you love? My fingers found the pocket watch in my blazer without conscious thought. Heavy brass, engraved on the back, the keeper of the flame, Vietnamese, like my mother's family, Nguyen Du Lua. He'd given it to me the day I made VP 6 years ago, clasped my hands around it and said, "This watch means you guard what we built. Keep it clean, even when it's hard." I'd carried it every day since. The irony burned worse than the betrayal. 3 months ago, I said, voice steadier now, during routine quarterly review, I identified a billing irregularity in regional operations payroll. I saw my father's shoulders tighten fractionally. No one else would have noticed. The irregularity led to a full audit. I opened the folder. The first page showed a payroll roster, 36 names highlighted in yellow. These employees were hired over 18 months through our regional operations division. All 36 reported to the same supervisor. All have forged credentials, 0 legitimate work histories. Frank leaned forward, frowning. "Forged? How is that possible? We have verification protocols." "Bypassed," I said, at the approval level. I slid the second document across the table. Authorization codes, approval signatures, all traceable to accounts Harold Garrett controlled. The room went very quiet. I didn't look at my father. Not yet. If I looked at him now, I might lose the resolve it had taken 3 months to build. The metal watch case felt ice cold through fabric, or maybe that was just my hands. The total payroll theft over 18 months amounts to $6.2 million, I continued, hearing my voice like it belonged to someone else. The systematic nature of the fraud, the level of access required, and the approval chain all point to Saskia. My father's voice, quiet and steady. The voice that had read me bedtime stories, taught me to read blueprints, told me I could run this company someday. I made myself look at him. His face was calm, resigned, not surprised. That was the worst part. He wasn't surprised I'd found it. He'd known I would. "You don't have to do this," he said, but we both knew I did. For a heartbeat, I could close the folder. Say it was a false alarm, somebody else's fault. Protect him the way he'd protected me my entire life. The board would believe me. Frank trusted Harold implicitly, they all did. Then I thought of Wendy Harrington's findings when I'd asked HR to dig deeper. I thought of Inez Caldwell, the name that kept appearing in old personnel files, the woman whose silence had cost her everything. I thought of Collin and the systematic theft my father's inaction had enabled. He knew, I said to the board, voice breaking. From the very first planted employee, my father knew. Frank's face went pale. "Harold?" My father said nothing, just looked at me with something that might have been pride or might have been grief. "Ms. Garrett, are you saying?" "Yes." I opened my mouth to begin the presentation that would end everything. But to understand how I ended up here, folder open, evidence damning, father across the table waiting for me to destroy him, you need to know. It started 3 months ago, on a Friday afternoon in March, when the numbers first stopped adding up. 3 months earlier, on a Friday afternoon in March, when Des Moines still smelled like thawing snow, I had no idea that line item 447 on the quarterly expense report would unravel 45 years of my father's legacy. I sat at my desk, reviewing Q1 financials the way I'd done 40 times before. Routine, methodical, the kind of work that felt like keeping a promise, numbers adding up cleanly, production costs tracking predictably, everything running the way Harold had taught me a well-managed company should run. Storage and warehousing costs caught my eye first, not because they were catastrophic, but because they were wrong. First quarter last year, $180,000. This quarter, $340,000, nearly double, with no corresponding increase in production volume to justify it. I pulled up the detailed breakdown. The majority of the increase, $160,000 over 3 months, came from a single vendor, Caldwell Industrial Storage Solutions. The name meant nothing to me. 10 years I'd been at this company. I knew our suppliers, our contractors, our service providers by heart. I'd negotiated renewals with half of them personally, but Caldwell Industrial Storage Solutions? Completely unfamiliar. Must be new, I said to the empty office. Regional expansion, maybe. Harold would have mentioned a new warehousing contract this size. We had weekly operations meetings where he still insisted on reviewing major vendor relationships, even though he'd officially handed day-to-day management to me 2 years ago. The founder who couldn't quite let go, I'd found it endearing. I pulled the vendor file from our accounting system. Company registered 8 months ago, August 2019. Address listed as a P.O. box in West Des Moines. Services, warehouse and logistics management. Contract value up to $400,000 annually. How many quarterly reviews had I completed without finding a single irregularity? I scrolled through the approval documentation. A single-page service agreement. Minimal due diligence, paperwork, none of the usual reference checks, insurance verification, or facility inspections we required for vendors handling our inventory. The contract had been approved and signed within 3 days of submission. 3 days for a $400,000 annual contract with a company that had existed for less than a year. My stomach tightened. I clicked through to the payment history. 5 invoices over the past 8 months. $32,000, $41,000, $53,000, $62,000. The amounts were climbing steadily, all paid within standard terms, no disputes, no questions. I checked the billing details, generic line items, warehouse management services, logistics coordination, inventory handling, nothing specific enough to verify, no warehouse location listed beyond the P.O. box, no inventory manifest attached. The approval signature at the bottom made me pause, not because I recognized it, but because of how fast it had moved through our system. Normally, a contract this size would route through procurement, operations review, finance approval, then final sign-off. Multiple levels, multiple days. This one had been flagged as urgent and pushed through in 72 hours. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Maybe there was a good explanation. Emergency warehousing, need I hadn't been looped in on. Special project, Harold was managing directly. Temporary overflow during the winter production surge. Except we hadn't had a winter production surge. We'd been flat compared to last year. I looked at the clock. 5:45. Most of the office had cleared out already. Friday evening, end of first quarter, people were eager to start their weekends. I should call Harold. Ask him directly about Caldwell Industrial. Get the simple explanation. Laugh about how I'd gotten suspicious over nothing. But what if there was nothing to be suspicious about? What if I was seeing patterns where none existed, questioning my father's judgment over a perfectly legitimate vendor relationship I just happened to miss in the weekly meetings? I printed the vendor file and the 5 invoices, slipped them into my briefcase with the quarterly report. 6:30, I was at my apartment dining table with the printouts spread in front of me. The pocket watch Harold had given me sat next to the suspicious invoices, its engraved words catching the lamplight. Nguiju Lua, the keeper of the flame. Keep it clean, he'd said when he gave it to me, even when it's hard. I studied the invoices again, the P.O. box address, the generic service descriptions, the climbing payment amounts, the too fast approval. 8 months. Nearly $350,000 paid to a company that barely existed on paper. My phone sat on the table. I could call him right now. Harold would answer. He always answered when I called. He'd explain everything, probably tease me gently about being too thorough, remind me that I couldn't audit every vendor relationship personally, unless I was right to be suspicious. The pocket watch sat there like a silent judge, its promise reflecting lamplight, keeper of the flame, guardian of what my father built. I picked up my red pen and circled the vendor name, Caldwell Industrial Storage Solutions. Monday morning, first thing, I'd pull the physical contract file from archives, visit the P.O. box address, see if there was an actual facility, cross-reference the vendor ownership records with the Secretary of State database. Standard due diligence, the kind we should have done before approving the contract. Quietly, before alerting Harold, before raising false alarms that might embarrass us both. One suspicious line item, I told myself, probably nothing. I wrote Monday's agenda at the top of the page. Warehouse address verification, contract history review, ownership records check. I had no idea that by week's end, I'd be mapping a network of 36 names, all leading back to one devastating truth that would put me in that boardroom 3 months later, folder open, father across the table, about to destroy everything. The GPS said I'd arrived at Caldwell Industrial Storage Solutions, but all I saw through the windshield was cracked asphalt, knee-high weeds, and a rusted loading sign tilted sideways behind an abandoned strip mall. I circled the block, checked the printed invoice again, 1947, Industrial Parkway East, Des Moines, Iowa. The address matched. The GPS insisted I was here. There was no warehouse, no building, no foundation, no evidence any structure had ever existed on this lot. I pulled into what used to be a parking area, gravel and broken pavement behind a shuttered Dollar General. A chain-link fence sagged along the back property line. The only sign of industrial activity was that rusted placard, "Loading zone, no parking." Saturday morning, 10 days after I'd first flagged the vendor. I'd spent the week trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Emergency warehousing situation I'd missed. Temporary overflow facility Harold had arranged directly. Something. This wasn't something. This was nothing. I got out of the car, walked the perimeter of the lot, checked the address plaque on the light pole, 1847. Pulled up the invoice on my phone and compared the printed address to the empty gravel in front of me. My company had paid this location over $300,000 in the past 9 months for warehouse storage and logistics management. This was the moment doubt became proof, the moment a suspicious line item became evidence of crime. I photographed everything: the empty lot, the address sign, the abandoned strip mall, the rusted loading placard. Then I sat in my car with the engine idling and pulled every Caldwell Industrial invoice from the passenger seat. Not just this quarter, every payment since the vendor appeared in our system. August 2019, $32,000. September, $38,000. October, $41,000. November through February, climbing steadily. March, the $62,000 that had finally caught my attention. I added them in my head twice, then used my phone calculator to be sure. $520,000. Paid to a company operating from an empty lot that had probably been vacant for years. How long had this been running? Who approved these invoices month after month without questioning the vendor? My hands were shaking. I set the invoices down and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. This wasn't an accounting error. This wasn't miscommunication or sloppy documentation. This was deliberate, systematic fraud. Someone had built this vendor, created the company registration, submitted the contract proposal, generated monthly invoices with just enough detail to look legitimate. Someone had approved those invoices and authorized the payments. Someone had collected over $500,000 from my family's company for services that never existed. Who? I drove home with the question circling in my head like a trapped bird. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, my dining table had disappeared under spreadsheets, HR records, and vendor files. I'd pulled everything I could access remotely from our system employee directory, organizational charts, vendor registration documents, payment authorization logs. Caldwell Industrial Storage Solutions was registered to a shell company with a P.O. box address. Standard incorporation paperwork, minimal details. The registration listed one officer, C. Caldwell. I searched our employee directory for Caldwell. One result: Collin Caldwell, 44 years old, regional operations manager based in our Cedar Rapids satellite office. Hired 3 years ago. I'd met him maybe twice, brief interactions at company events, the kind of polite small talk you make with colleagues you barely know. Coincidence? Maybe. Caldwell wasn't an uncommon surname. I pulled his HR file. Previous employer, a fabrication company that had gone bankrupt. References on file, background check completed, hire approved through standard channels. Nothing obviously suspicious. Except now, his name was on a fake vendor collecting $500,000. I started cross-referencing. Vendor contact information against employee records, phone numbers, former addresses, emergency contact listings. The first match hit like ice water. The phone number for Caldwell Industrial's accounts payable contact belonged to someone named Marcus Delacroix, hired 2 years ago in our purchasing department. I kept searching. The vendor's warehouse manager contact shared an address with Corbin Delaney, shipping coordinator hired 18 months ago. Another match, another. I opened a new spreadsheet and started logging connections. Employee name, department, hire date, relationship to vendor contacts or each other. The list grew. Purchasing, shipping, payroll, inventory management, internal controls. By 7 o'clock, the count had reached 36. 36 names, 36 people embedded across our company's operations, not scattered randomly positioned. Purchasing agents who could approve invoices, payroll coordinators who could add employees, shipping managers who could sign off on phantom deliveries, internal auditors who could overlook discrepancies. They weren't everywhere, but they were in exactly the right places to make fraud invisible. I taped sheets of paper to my living room wall and started building a network chart, names connected by red lines showing department overlaps, approval chains, shared addresses, or references. The pattern emerged like a constellation appearing in a dark sky. This wasn't one person stealing opportunistically. This wasn't even a small group exploiting a gap in controls. This was organized, coordinated, planned infiltration over 3 years. 36 names, 36 people, too many for coincidence, too organized for chaos. I stepped back from the wall, staring at the web of connections. My stomach felt hollow. My apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. Somewhere in our company's approval archives, there had to be signatures. Authorization for these hires, approval for the vendor contracts, sign-offs on the invoices that had drained over $500,000. Somewhere in those records, I'd find the name of whoever had let 36 people through the door. The approval signature, buried in archived payments from 4 years ago, was unmistakably my father's blue ink, decisive slant, approving $15,000 for special assistance to I. Caldwell, with no explanation beyond those 3 words. I'd spent Tuesday evening in the company archive room after everyone left, pulling authorization records for the 36 employees on my network chart. Most had standard hire approvals routine paperwork, nothing unusual. But the payment approvals told a different story. I started 4 years back when the oldest suspicious hire had joined, cross-referencing dates, looking for patterns. That's when I found it a one-time payment dated June 2016, 4 years before the warehouse fraud began. Amount, $15,000. Category, special assistance. Payee, I. Caldwell. Harold Garrett's signature at the bottom. I sat on the archive room floor with the document in my hands, fluorescent lights humming overhead. I. Caldwell. Inez Caldwell? Personnel records showed Collin's emergency contact as Inez Caldwell mother, same last name, same initial. Why would my father personally approve $15,000 to Collin Caldwell's mother 4 years ago? No invoice, no justification, no supporting documentation. Just those 3 words, special assistance to I. Caldwell. My father's handwriting, the same blue pen he'd used to sign my birthday cards, my VP appointment letter, the inscription on my pocket watch authorizing money to the family, now stealing from him, or stealing from us, or stealing with his knowledge. I photographed the document, added it to my encrypted evidence folder, put the file back exactly where I'd found it, and left through the side exit. By midnight, I was searching for forensic accountants, not company auditors, they reported to Harold. I needed someone completely outside our organization, someone who could trace what I might miss, someone my father didn't control. When had protecting the company started to mean hiding from the man who built it? I found Wendy Harrington on the 3rd page of results. 15 years specializing in corporate fraud investigation. Former FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Now independent consultant based in Des Moines. Testimonials mentioned discretion and an ability to find patterns others missed. I called from my personal phone the next morning. Left a message about potential financial irregularities at a family business. No company name, no details. She called back within an hour. We arranged to meet Saturday morning at a coffee shop in West Des Moines, 30 minutes from headquarters. The guilt felt like swallowing broken glass. Saturday morning, the coffee shop smelled like espresso and cinnamon. I arrived early, chose a corner booth, spread my evidence across the table, photos of the empty lot, invoices, the network chart showing 36 names, the archived payment to I. Caldwell with Harold's signature. Wendy Harrington arrived exactly on time, 40 years old, with sharp eyes and a methodical way of examining documents. She studied each piece without speaking for 5 minutes. Finally, she looked up. 36 people is coordinated placement. This took years to build. You're looking at systematic infiltration. I know, I said. I need to know how deep it goes. Every dollar, every approval, every connection, but I can't use company resources. Because you don't know who's involved, Wendy finished. Smart. What's your relationship to the company? Vice President of Operations. And it's my father's company. He's founder and chairman. She nodded, no judgment in her expression. Does he know you're investigating? No. Good. Keep it that way until we know what we're dealing with. She tapped the archived payment. This is 4 years old, before the warehouse fraud started. But it's connected, same family name, personal approval from your father. That's not coincidence. Can you trace all of it? I asked. Every transaction, every approval, without anyone at the company knowing? I can. I'll need access to your financial systems, but we can do it remotely under the guise of routine compliance auditing. 3 weeks for a preliminary report, maybe 6 for complete investigation. I nodded. Whatever it costs, I'll pay personally. She named a figure that would drain half my savings. I agreed without hesitation. Wendy gathered the documents, sliding them into her briefcase with practiced efficiency. Then she paused, met my eyes across the table. Ms. Garrett, she said quietly, in my experience, when fraud at this scale goes undetected this long, it's because someone in a position to stop it decided not to. Someone with authority saw it and chose not to act. Prepare yourself for that possibility. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm. You're saying someone high up knew, I said. I'm saying it's likely. She closed her briefcase. I'll start with the approval chains and payment histories. I'll contact you through the encrypted channel you provided. And Ms. Garrett, don't confront anyone until you have the complete picture, no matter how much you want to. I watched her leave, then sat alone in the booth, staring at the table where I'd just hired someone to investigate whether my father had been complicit in stealing from his own company. Someone in authority saw it and chose not to stop it. I already knew whose authority she meant. 3 weeks of waiting ended when Wendy Harrington slid a manila folder across the coffee shop table and said, I've confirmed the fraud, traced the money, and mapped the network. But there's something you need to understand before we go further. I'd spent those 3 weeks in a kind of suspended dread, going to work every day, sitting through operations meetings with my father, reviewing quarterly projections, pretending everything was normal while Wendy's investigation ran silently in the background like a countdown timer I couldn't see. Now the timer had reached 0. We were back at the same West Des Moines coffee shop, same corner booth. 10 in the morning on a Thursday. I'd told my assistant I had a doctor's appointment. Wendy opened the folder. Inside were spreadsheets, wire transfer records, vendor registration documents, system access logs, all color-coded and cross-referenced with the methodical precision of someone who'd built fraud cases for 15 years. $6.2 million, she said, over 6 years, verified through bank records, vendor registrations, and payment trails. The number hung in this air between us like smoke. 6 million, I whispered. My God. I'd thought the warehouse fraud was bad. $500,000 felt catastrophic. But this $6.2 million stolen from my family's company over 6 years while I worked there, while I reviewed quarterly reports, while I sat in budget meetings discussing cost controls. The warehouse was just one piece, Wendy continued. She spread several documents across the table. There are 7 ghost vendors total. Caldwell Industrial Storage was actually one of the smaller ones. There are also 12 diverted material contracts, legitimate shipments, rerouted and sold elsewhere, and payroll padding across 3 departments. I stared at the evidence, invoice after invoice, vendor after vendor, names I recognized from our accounting system, addresses that probably didn't exist, payments that had flowed out month after month. All 36 people on your network chart are confirmed active participants, Wendy said, though their levels of involvement vary. Some knew exactly what they were doing, creating false invoices, approving fraudulent contracts. Others were following orders from supervisors they trusted, maybe not realizing the full scope. How many board meetings had I attended while this machine ran beneath them, stealing thousands of dollars every month? Walk me through how it worked, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Wendy nodded. Think of it as an ecosystem. Purchasing employees approve false contracts for goods or services that don't exist. Logistics coordinators confirm false deliveries. Payroll processes the invoices. Internal controls look the other way at critical moments, or they're occupied with other audits when suspicious transactions occur. She pulled out an organizational chart showing the 36 employees positioned across different departments. See how they're distributed? Not random. Strategically placed at control points where they can either approve transactions or avoid scrutinizing them. How long, I asked. When did this start? Earliest confirmed transaction is 6 years ago, Wendy said. But there are older payments I'm still tracing, including that $15,000 payment to Caldwell you found. That one predates the systematic fraud by 2 years, so it might be unrelated. Or it might be how this whole thing began. 6 years. This had been running for 6 years. The money, I said. Where did it go? Shell companies registered to relatives of the core participants, then dispersed through various accounts. I'm still tracing the endpoints, but we're talking about a sophisticated operation. Whoever designed this understood corporate accounting systems and knew how to exploit gaps in oversight. I thought of Collin Caldwell, Regional Operations Manager, whose name connected to the fake warehouse vendor. You think Collin Caldwell orchestrated this? He's central to it, Wendy confirmed. But she paused, and her expression darkened. There's something else. She flipped to the final page in the folder. System access logs, rows of timestamps and account identifiers. This is what concerns me most, she said. There's an administrative account, high-level access, override permissions that appears in system logs around every major fraudulent transaction. Not executing the transactions, just accessing the files, almost like monitoring. My throat went tight. Monitoring or enabling. I can't tell yet. The account identity is masked in your current IT records. Whoever set it up knew how to bury their digital footprint. Wendy tapped the page. I need access to older system backups to trace who created this account and when. That'll require cooperation from your IT department. And if I request that access, IT will ask why, I said slowly. Yes, which means whoever owns this account might find out we're investigating. My fingers found the pocket watch in my blazer. Its engraved promise suddenly felt like an accusation. Keep the flame. Guard what we built. What if the person who'd let this company burn was the same person who'd given me that watch? How long to identify the account owner? I asked. A week if IT cooperates quickly. Maybe sooner if I can access backup systems remotely. Wendy closed the folder, her eyes steady on my face. But Ms. Garrett, whoever owns that account, has been watching this fraud develop for years. They had the authority to stop it. They chose not to. I understand, I said. When I confirm their identity, Wendy continued quietly, you need to be prepared for the answer, prepared to act on it, no matter who it is. I met her eyes. I hired you to find the truth. I'll deal with whatever the truth is. But we both knew I was lying. We both knew exactly whose name I was terrified she'd find on that account. And we both knew that when she did, I'd have to choose between protecting my father and protecting everything he'd built. Walking through Garrett Steele's headquarters felt like moving through a crime scene where everyone still believed it was just an ordinary office, except me, who now saw guilt in every approval signature and conspiracy in every departmental hallway. I'd left Wendy's meeting with a week to wait while she traced the mystery account. A week of pretending I didn't know my company was bleeding millions. A week of acting normal. I made it 3 hours. Near the archive room that afternoon, I nearly collided with Wanda Townsend carrying old ledgers. At 62, Wanda had worked in accounting for 40 years since the company was one warehouse and big dreams. She looked at the folder in my hands, then at my face. Something shifted in her expression. Saskia, she said carefully, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. Just quarterly reviews, I said. Wanda set her box down, glanced down the hallway. I've been here a long time, since your father had one warehouse and couldn't always make payroll. I remember the early days, old arrangements, old promises. My pulse quickened. What kind of arrangements? The kind that get buried in archives, she said quietly. The kind people don't talk about. Your father built something remarkable, but every foundation has compromises. What had Wanda seen 40 years ago that she couldn't or wouldn't say aloud? Wanda, if you know something about company finances, talk to Harold, she interrupted. Ask him about the early days, about who helped him build this place, about promises he made before you were born. She picked up her box. That's all I can say, dear. Some questions are best asked directly to your father. She walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. 2 hours later, I sat across from Collin Caldwell in a small conference room, a single invoice spread between us. I'd barely interacted with Collin in his 8 years at the company. He'd worked out of Cedar Rapids until 2 years ago when he transferred to headquarters as regional operations manager. 44 years old, quiet demeanor, competent reports. The kind of employee who didn't cause problems. Except now I knew he was central to a conspiracy that had stolen millions. I'd pulled one of Wendy's flagged invoices, $47,000 to Midwest Industrial Supply for materials that probably never existed. Thanks for meeting on short notice, I said. I'm reviewing procurement patterns. This vendor, Midwest Industrial Supply. Can you walk me through how this contract was approved? Collin leaned forward, glanced at the invoice. Standard process. Market prices went up last quarter. We needed alternative suppliers. I vetted them. Purchasing approved it. And the delivery confirmation? The storage location doesn't match our facilities. I'd interviewed dozens of vendors over the years, learned to read hesitation and honesty in body language. Collin's eyes flicked away for half a second. Sometimes shipping addresses get coded differently in the system. Depends on which warehouse has capacity. This address isn't any of our warehouses, I said. It's a P.O. box. Then it's probably the vendor's address, not the delivery location. He straightened papers that didn't need straightening. Look, if there's a paperwork discrepancy, I'm happy to pull the full file. Administrative errors happen. His explanation was smooth. Practiced. Market conditions, supplier logistics, normal business variations, all the right words. But his hands kept moving, adjusting the invoice, tapping his pen, shifting in his chair. His eyes wouldn't hold mine. His breathing had accelerated. Everything about his body language screamed guilt. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked quietly. Collin went still. "Doing what?" "Your job. How long at headquarters?" The pause lasted a fraction too long. 2 years here, 8 total with the company. Is there a specific problem? Just trying to understand our procurement history. You've been very helpful. He stood, gathering papers with hands that trembled slightly. Of course, happy to pull the complete file if you need more documentation. I'll let you know. Collin left walking, just a fraction too fast, papers clutched against his chest. Through the glass wall, I watched him turn the corner. Then I saw him stop, pull out his phone. His posture was rigid, urgent. I was calling someone, warning someone. I sat alone staring at the invoice. $47,000 for materials that didn't exist, approved through a network of 36 people, monitored by a mystery account. I was terrified belonged to my father. And now the conspiracy knew I was asking questions. I'd spent weeks investigating quietly, gathering evidence before anyone realized. That advantage was gone. Collin would warn whoever he reported to. The network would start protecting itself, destroying evidence, coordinating stories. My phone buzzed. A text from Wendy. "Breakthrough on account ID. Can you talk?" I stepped into an empty stairwell and called her. "I found him," Wendy said, without preamble. "The account owner. But before I tell you, I need to know, are you ready for this? Because once you know, you can't unknow it." I closed my eyes. "Tell me." "Harold Garrett," she said. "The mystery account belongs to your father." Harold Garrett. The mystery account belongs to your father. Wendy's words were still echoing in my head. Tuesday morning, when the call from Anderson Automotive came through their quarterly steel order worth $340,000, 3 days late, despite clear weather and confirmed on-time production, and the plant manager's voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I don't care what your shipping records say," he snapped. "We scheduled plant downtime based on your delivery window. 3 days late costs us money, Saskia. This is the second time this quarter." I pulled up the order on my screen while he vented. Anderson Automotive was a major client, 15 years of consistent business, never a serious complaint until recently. "I'm looking at it now," I said. "Let me get back to you within the hour." I hung up and headed straight to the factory floor. The shipping records showed Anderson's order had left our warehouse Thursday morning, exactly on schedule. Production logs confirmed the steel beams were fabricated Tuesday, inspected Wednesday, loaded Thursday at 6 a.m. So where had the shipment been for 3 days? I found Corbin Delaney near the loading docks, clipboard in hand, coordinating an outbound delivery. At 38, Corbin had worked in logistics for 6 years and had a reputation for efficiency. He was also on Wendy's list of 36. "Corbin," I called. "Anderson Automotive's order. Left here Thursday morning, confirmed by our production log. Why did it arrive Monday instead of Friday?" He barely glanced up from his clipboard. "Regional carrier issues. Weather delays in..." "Weather was clear," I interrupted. "I already checked NOAA data for the entire route. Where was this shipment for 3 days?" Corbin's hand tightened on the clipboard. "I'd have to check with the carrier. Sometimes they consolidate loads, add stops. This was direct delivery, premium rate for guaranteed timeline. I stepped closer. Where was it, Corbin? He met my eyes for 2 seconds, then looked away. I'll pull the tracking details and send them to your office. He walked away before I could press further. How many clients had they lost over the years to unexplained delays while logistics coordinators padded their fees? The fraud wasn't just stealing money. It was sabotaging operations, damaging client relationships, destroying the reputation my father had spent 45 years building. Anderson Automotive might forgive 1 late delivery, 2, 3. Eventually, they'd find a more reliable supplier. And the conspirators didn't care. They were bleeding the company dry from the inside while clients watched our reliability collapse. Back at my desk, I found an email from Frank Whitfield. Emergency board meeting, 3 p.m. today, attendance mandatory. The conference room felt smaller, with all 5 board members present. Frank sat at the head of the table, my father to his right. Harold looked calm, composed, exactly how someone looks when they don't know their daughter, just discovered they'd been monitoring a massive fraud for years. Or exactly how someone looks when they do know, and they're waiting to see what she'll do about it. Thank you for coming on short notice, Frank said. The board needs to formalize Harold's retirement transition. Given recent operational issues and the upcoming fiscal quarter deadline, we're implementing a 10 business day timeline to finalize succession. 10 days, 10 business days to dismantle a 6-year conspiracy. Saskia, you're the presumed successor, Frank continued. Your performance as VP has been exemplary, but if there are unresolved management issues affecting company stability, we'll need to consider alternatives, external candidates, interim leadership, whatever protects shareholder value. The message was clear. Fix whatever's broken, prove you can handle it, or we'll bring in outsiders. Harold said nothing, just sat there with his hands folded, watching me. I understand, I said. 10 days is sufficient. Liar. 10 days wasn't sufficient. 10 days was impossible. The meeting adjourned 20 minutes later. I went back to my office, closed the door, and pulled out a notepad. What had to happen in the next 10 days? Expose theft, totaling over $6 million. Identify and terminate 36 co-conspirators embedded across critical departments. Confront the mystery account owner, my father, about why he'd watched this fraud develop without stopping it. Protect the company from scandal that could destroy client relationships and tank our value. Prove to the board I could handle a crisis this catastrophic. Secure succession approval before they brought in outside management. All while the fraud network knew I was investigating and was already protecting itself. The pocket watch sat on my desk where I'd left it that morning. Ngui Julua, the keeper of the flame, my father's gift, his charge, his impossible expectation. The engraved words felt less like honor and more like sentencing. 10 days to save the company Dad built, I whispered. 10 days before they bring in outsiders. Wendy still needed to show me the full evidence about Harold's account. Collin knew I was watching him. The board thought I might not be able to handle this. And somewhere in this building, 35 other co-conspirators were going about their business, stealing money, sabotaging shipments, pretending to be loyal employees. Keep it clean, I said to the empty office. How am I supposed to keep anything clean when everything's already buried in lies? My phone buzzed. Text from Wendy. Account documentation complete. Can meet tomorrow morning. You need to see the full evidence before you do anything else. This is bigger than we thought. I stared at the message. Tomorrow morning would be day 9. 9 days left to save everything. Whatever Wendy had found about my father's involvement, whatever proof she'd compiled, it was urgent enough that her professional calm had cracked. I texted back, same coffee shop, 8 a.m. Then I sat in my office as the sun set outside, pocket watch ticking on my desk, counting down the hours until I'd have to face the complete truth about what my father had done. Wendy Harrington's face told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. The forensic investigator who'd maintained professional calm through 15 years of corporate fraud cases looked like she'd just watched someone's world end and was about to deliver the killing blow. We sat in the same corner booth at 8 a.m., 9 days left until the board deadline. Wendy slid her laptop across the table. The screen showed system access logs, rows of timestamps highlighted in yellow. "This is the administrative account we've been tracking," she said quietly. It accessed fraud-related files 247 times over 6 years. After fake invoices were processed, after suspicious wire transfers cleared, after each new hire in the conspiracy network, 247 deliberate accesses, not random, not accidental. "Monitoring it," I said. Someone was tracking the fraud as it happened, not just monitoring. Wendy scrolled through the log. "Look at the pattern. An invoice gets approved Monday. The account accesses that file Tuesday morning. A new employee joins purchasing on the 15th. The account reviews their paperwork on the 16th. This is deliberate, systematic tracking." The coffee shop, sounds clinking cups, soft conversation, espresso machine, hissing faded into white noise as I stared at the access logs. "Whoever owns this account knew exactly what was being stolen," Wendy continued, "and chose not to stop it for 6 years. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the table. "Who is it?" Wendy opened a second file, IT backup records, account creation logs, security clearance documentation. The account was created 6 years ago using Harold Garrett's administrative credentials, his security access, his digital signature. The creation timestamp shows it was set up the same week the first planted employee was hired. The world tilted. "No," I said. "Someone could have stolen his credentials. I checked that." Wendy pulled up another screen. Biometric timestamps from building security, access locations, matching Harold's office, login behavior patterns consistent with his documented work habits. Every access occurred during business hours when Harold was confirmed on site. "Harold Garrett, my father, the man who built everything. Saskia," Wendy's voice was gentle but unyielding. "Your father has been watching this fraud develop since day one. He created this account specifically to monitor it, and he never said a word." I couldn't breathe. The evidence stared back from the screen, cold, digital, irrefutable. 6 years, 247 accesses, every planted employee, every fake invoice, every stolen dollar tracked and observed and allowed to continue. And he'd said nothing, not to the board, not to auditors, not to me. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would he just watch? Let them steal from him?" "That's not a question I can answer with evidence," Wendy said. "You'll have to ask him directly." I sat frozen, coffee going cold. 6 years of conversations recontextualized themselves. Harold's trust in my judgment when I became VP, his calm when I mentioned reviewing procurement, the pocket watch he'd given me, engraved with Ngui Julu, keeper of the flame, while he let the company burn. "Keep it clean," he'd said, "even when it's hard." He'd known it was already filthy, known exactly how filthy, down to the precise dollar amount and specific names. And he'd watched me investigate for months, hiring Wendy, tracing the network, discovering the empty lot, confronting Collin without saying a single word. "When did you confirm it was Harold?" I asked. 2 days ago. I wanted to be absolutely certain before I told you. Triple-checked the biometrics, verified access patterns, cross-referenced security footage. There's no doubt. 2 days. She'd known for 2 days and waited to be sure. Is there anything that explains why? I asked. Any pattern that suggests... He reviewed the files related to I. Caldwell most frequently, Wendy said. The $15,000 payment from 4 years ago. He accessed that record 17 times over the past year alone. I. Caldwell, Inez Caldwell, Collin's mother, the name that kept appearing in old records, the person my father had paid $15,000 with no explanation. Whatever this was, it started there. With that payment, with that person. The pocket watch in my blazer felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Its engraved promise, now a lie wrapped in gold. What do I do? The question sounded pathetic. You confront him, Wendy said. You take this evidence and ask him why. Then you decide what comes next, the board, law enforcement, whatever resolution you can live with. But you can't move forward until you know the truth. I gathered the printed evidence. Page after page of access logs, timestamps, file paths, proof that my father had betrayed everything he'd taught me about integrity and responsibility. 9 days until the board deadline. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into Harold's office with this folder, put it on his desk, and demand the truth. Why he'd watched his company bleed for 6 years. Why he'd stayed silent while his daughter investigated alone. Why he'd given me a watch engraved with a responsibility he'd abandoned himself. Whatever his answer, nothing would ever be the same between us. I stood, legs unsteady, and walked out into morning sunlight that felt too bright, too ordinary for the world that had just collapsed. Harold Garrett sat behind his desk like a man waiting for a verdict he'd already pronounced on himself, 70 years old. Shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen, hands folded over the same chipped blue coffee mug he'd used since before I was born. I'd rehearsed this confrontation through a sleepless night. Practiced the accusation, the demand for answers, the cold presentation of evidence. I'd imagined his denials, his excuses, his shock at being caught. I walked through his office door at 7:30 in the morning, Wendy's folder clutched in my hands. 9 days left before the board deadline. Harold looked up, saw the folder, met my eyes, and, before I could speak, before I could accuse or demand or break, he said quietly, I knew from the first name on that list. The words hit me like a physical blow. I knew what Collin was doing, he continued, voice steady and calm and terrible. I knew about the money. I knew about the network. I've known since the beginning. My prepared speech evaporated. You what? I know what's in that folder, Saskia. I know what Wendy Harrington found. The account, the access logs, the monitoring pattern. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down. I couldn't move, couldn't process. He'd just confessed. Immediately. No denial, no defensiveness, no pretense of innocence. Just calm admission of 6 years of complicity. The folder slipped from my numb fingers, landing on his desk with a soft thud. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent office. 6 years, I whispered. You knew for 6 years. Yes. I came to you for advice. Months ago, when I first found the billing irregularity, asked if I was seeing patterns that weren't there, and you already knew. Yes. The silence stretched between us like a chasm opening, swallowing everything I'd planned to say. Outside Harold's window, the factory floor hummed with morning shift startup. Machinery warming up, workers clocking in, steel being fabricated into beams that would hold up buildings across the Midwest. The company he'd built 45 years ago, running like it had every morning of my entire life. Except it had been bleeding millions while we both pretended everything was normal. I watched you investigate, Harold said. His voice was quieter now, almost gentle. Watched you hire an outside investigator, trace the network, map the conspiracy. I knew what you'd find eventually. And you said nothing. My voice cracked. You let me think I was protecting you. Let me kill myself trying to solve this quietly before it destroyed your legacy. And you knew everything. I did. The calm in his voice made it worse somehow. No defensiveness, no excuses, just acknowledgement. Fury finally broke through the shock. My hands clenched into fists. Why? The word came out harsh, almost a shout. Why would you just watch them bleed this company? Watch them steal millions, sabotage client relationships, damage everything you built? Harold didn't flinch, because I deserved it. I stared at him. What? I didn't stay silent from weakness, Saskia. He met my eyes, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen before, something like shame, like old grief wearing a familiar face. I stayed silent because I owed a debt to the people stealing from him. That's insane, I said. You think owing someone a debt justifies letting them commit fraud, letting them destroy, not just someone. Harold stood slowly, moved to the window overlooking the factory floor. Collin's mother, Inez Caldwell. You found the payment from 4 years ago, $15,000 marked special assistance. You've been trying to figure out what that meant. The payment, the name that kept appearing in old records, in Wendy's notes, in Wanda Townsend's cryptic warnings. What about her, I asked. Harold's reflection in the window looked older than I'd ever seen him. Inez helped me build this place 45 years ago when I had one rented warehouse and more ambition than capital. She contributed her savings, her labor, her engineering knowledge. We had a relationship, business and personal, all tangled together the way things get when you're young and desperate and building something from nothing. I waited, watching my father's shoulders hunch forward like he was carrying weight I couldn't see. When our relationship ended, he said quietly, I pushed her out, told her the capital she'd invested was a loan, not equity, paid her back at 5% interest when she'd been promised 15% ownership, erased her contributions from company history because keeping her name attached meant acknowledging what I'd done. The pocket watch in my blazer keeper of the flame felt like a weight made of broken promises. You want to know why I let Collin Caldwell steal from me? Harold's voice was heavy. Why I watched and did nothing. Because his mother helped me build this place. And when we ended our relationship, I pushed her out. I owed her what she was owed, and I never paid. So when her son came for what I took from her, when he embedded his people in my company and started bleeding it dry, I let him, because I deserved it. He turned from the window to face me. I owed Inez Caldwell 45 years of partnership equity I stole from her, and I've spent 45 years knowing I was a thief, calling myself an honest man. Harold's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of 45 years back to when Garrett Steele was just a rented warehouse, a used pickup truck, and two people who believed they could build something that would last. I met Inez Caldwell in 1975, he said quietly, still standing at the window. I had ambition, no capital. Banks wouldn't touch me 25 years old with big ideas and nothing to back them up. Inez believed in me when no one else did. I stood frozen by his desk, trying to reconcile this story with the man I'd known my entire life. She gave me $40,000, Harold continued. Her family's money. That's what bought our first hydraulic press, our first warehouse lease, kept us alive the first year when orders were sparse and bills were constant. $40,000 in 1975, a massive sum, more than most houses cost then. But she wasn't just money, Saskia. He turned to face me. She worked alongside me, negotiated contracts I couldn't have won because I didn't know how to talk to purchasing managers, managed our books when I barely understood accounting, found our first 3 major clients through connections I didn't have. This company, He gestured at the factory floor beyond the window. It was ours. Everything we built together. I looked out at the factory floor my father built. No, the factory he and Inez built together before he erased her from the story. Then why is it called Garrett Steel? I asked, though I already knew the answer would hurt. Harold's expression tightened. Because I put my name on the lease, on the incorporation papers. She trusted me to make it official later, to add her as partner when we had time to do the paperwork properly. We were too busy building to worry about formalities. Of course, the oldest betrayal in the book. Trust without documentation. What happened? I asked. I met your mother in 1978. Harold sat down heavily in his chair. Inez and our relationship ended. She wanted out, wanted fair buyout for what she'd contributed. 3 years of capital, labor, partnership. The company was worth over $1 million by then. I waited, dreading what came next. She asked for $200,000, 20% of assessed value. Fair, considering what she'd put in. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he picked up his coffee mug. I used lawyers, found loopholes in our vague early agreements, claimed her $40,000 was a loan, not investment, paid her $65,000, called it return of principal plus interest. At what point does guilt stop being penance and become just another form of theft? $65,000, I repeated, for 3 years of building a company together. She was pregnant with Collin when she left, Harold said. Tried to fight the payout legally, but I had better lawyers, cleaner paperwork. She took the money because she needed it to raise a child alone, and his voice broke slightly. I kept everything we'd built together and told myself it was legal, technical, fair. Disgust rose in my throat. This wasn't the man I knew, or maybe it was exactly the man I knew, and I'd never looked closely enough to see. You stole from her, I said. Yes. No defensiveness, no excuses, just acknowledgement. I stole from her, and I've spent 45 years knowing it. So when Collin showed up 6 years ago, Harold nodded, said he was Inez's son, wanted opportunities for family. I saw it as I thought it was penance, a way to pay back what I'd taken. Let him have advantages, turned blind eye to irregularities I would have questioned from anyone else. You let him steal because you felt guilty? I let him take what I thought I owed. Harold met my eyes. Small things at first. Questionable vendors, inflated invoices. I told myself it was just evening the scales, taking back what should have been his mother's anyway. Harold had tried to pay an old debt by letting new theft occur, and both women paid the price. But it wasn't small things, I said. It was millions, 36 people, 6 years of systematic fraud. I didn't realize he was building an empire of theft, Harold said. By the time I understood the scale, when I saw the network, the coordination, the millions being siphoned, I was paralyzed by my own complicity. You could have stopped it, I said. At any point, you could have stopped it. How? Harold's voice rose for the first time. By admitting I'd knowingly let it happen for years, by explaining to the board why I'd given Inez's son carte blanche to steal from us, by confessing I'd been monitoring theft as penance for my own theft 45 years ago. He stood, pacing behind his desk. I created the conditions for this, Saskia. I wronged Inez. I let Collin in, knowing he had reason to hate me. I watched it grow because I thought I deserved it. And by the time I realized I'd lost control, exposing the fraud meant exposing myself. I stood there, hands shaking, finally understanding the full scope. Harold had wronged Inez 45 years ago, stolen what she'd earned. Then he'd compounded it by letting Collin steal in her name 2 betrayals separated by decades, both still bleeding the company dry. Does Collin know? I asked, voice cold. Does he know you were letting him do this on purpose? Harold's silence was answer enough. I didn't know for certain, but he suspected. And that meant this entire fraud existed in a horrible gray zone where victim and perpetrator were both complicit, where theft was tangled with penance, where no one could speak the truth without admitting their own guilt. 3 people, Harold, Collin, and me, all trapped in the same silence for different reasons. I didn't knock before entering Collin Caldwell's office, the man who'd stolen over $6 million from a father who'd let him do it, both of them prisoners of a 45-year-old betrayal neither would name aloud. Collin looked up from his computer, surprise flickering across his face. I dropped Wendy's evidence folder on his desk, hard. Harold told me everything, I said, about your mother Inez, about the $40,000 she invested, about how he pushed her out and paid her a fraction of what she'd earned. Collin's hands stilled on his keyboard. He told me he's been watching you steal for 6 years, I continued, watching you build your network, embed 36 people across operations, bleed millions from this company. And he did nothing because he thought he owed it to her. How many families built their fortunes on what was left unsaid? Collin stood, moved to the window, buying time. Same gesture Harold had made this morning, same window, same view, same instinct to turn away. He told you that? Collin's voice was careful. All of it. I stepped closer. The monitoring account. The 247 times he accessed fraud files. Every invoice. Every planted employee. Every dollar you took, he watched it happen. Now tell me the truth, Collin. Did you know he was watching? The question hung between us like smoke, not did you know, but did you want to know? Collin turned from the window. His practiced calm was gone. I was trying to help my mother. She raised me alone after Harold pushed her out. My cousins, my family, they needed work. $6.2 million, I said. 36 people embedded in purchasing, logistics, payroll controls. That's not helping family. That's systematic theft. She's still waiting, Collin said quietly. 45 years, and my mother has never gotten what she was owed. Not the money, the acknowledgement that she'd built this place as much as he did. Something in his voice cracked. Did he really say he knew? Collin asked. Or did he just not stop it? He said he knew from the first name on your list. Collin sank into his chair like someone had cut his strings. Before I tell you what, Collin finally admitted the answer that completed this triangle of silence. I need you to weigh something. Comment A, if you think what Harold did was worse, or B, if you think what Collin did was worse, and add one short reason. Because what comes next shows how guilt and revenge can trap 3 people in the same lie. Quick note, some dialogue and emotional details ahead are recreated to capture the weight of this confrontation, but the core truth is what matters. I thought maybe he knew, Collin said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Approvals came too easy. Questions weren't asked. Things that should have been flagged just went through. He looked up at me. Not defiance, not anger, shame. But I never confirmed it, he continued. Never asked directly. Because if I asked and he said yes, if he admitted he was letting me steal on purpose, what did that make me? His son, I said quietly, taking what he owed your mother. And if I asked and he said no? Collin's hands trembled. If he stopped me, I'd lose the only thing connecting me to him. The only way Harold Garrett ever acknowledged I existed was by letting me take from him what he took from my mother. The office was silent except for the distant factory hum. So I never asked, Collin said. We both just pretended. He pretended he didn't know. I pretended I didn't know he knew. And we kept the lie going for 6 years because the truth would have ended everything. 3 generations, 3 silences, 1 company bleeding from wounds no one would name. I walked to the window where both men had stood. looking down at the factory floor built on Inez's stolen share. Workers who had no idea the foundation beneath them was fractured all the way down. 3 people who all knew. Harold knew he'd stolen from Inez and was letting her son steal in return. Collin knew Harold was probably aware, but never confirmed it, because confirmation meant losing his connection to the father who'd abandoned his mother. And I knew both were trapped in patterns they couldn't escape alone. All of us complicit in silence. The only way to break the cycle was to speak the truth out loud, no matter the cost. 8 days, I said, still facing the window. 8 days until the board deadline. 8 days to figure out how to pursue justice when the victim enabled the perpetrator and the perpetrator weaponized legitimate grievance. I turned to face Collin. He looked smaller, shoulders slumped, the confident manager facade completely gone. Starting tomorrow, I said, I'm going to design a solution none of us could face alone. Justice that acknowledges both the crime and the debt that spawned it. But first, are you going to keep pretending? Or are you finally ready to speak the truth? Collin met my eyes. What truth do you want, Saskia? That I stole millions? That I knew my mother deserved more and took it anyway? That I built an empire of theft to punish a man already punishing himself? He stood, pulled out a folder I recognized personnel files for the 36. All of it, he said, sliding it toward me. Every name, every dollar, every lie. You want the truth? Here it is. And when you figure out what justice looks like when everyone's guilty, you let me know. I sat at my kitchen table at midnight, staring at 2 problems that didn't fit on the same spreadsheet. How do you calculate justice for a theft committed 6 years ago and a debt owed for 45? Collin's personnel files lay spread across one side. 36 names embedded across purchasing, logistics, payroll, controls. Every one part of a system designed to bleed the company while Harold watched. On the other side sat evidence of Harold's original sin. The $40,000 Inez invested in 1975, the $65,000 he paid her instead of the $200,000 she'd earned. 45 years of compound interest on stolen partnership equity. 2 crimes, both real, both unresolved. My laptop glowed in the dark apartment, spreadsheet columns blurring. The pocket watch Harold gave me sat beside the keyboard, ticking steadily. Nguijulua, keep the flame. But which flame? The one Harold lit by stealing from Inez, or the one Collin ignited by stealing from Harold? The fraud was clear. $6.2 million through systematic payroll manipulation. 36 people in exactly the right positions. Criminal, prosecutable, simple. Harold's guilt was different. Not theft, abandonment, not fraud, silence. He'd wronged Inez decades ago, then compounded it by watching her son steal rather than face what he'd done. And Collin had weaponized legitimate grievance into systematic revenge. The pocket watch had stopped. I picked it up, wound it, heard the mechanism catch, remembered Harold winding it that first morning, hands steady, despite everything falling apart. I couldn't treat both crimes the same. That realization cut through the exhaustion. Collin's theft required prosecution, legal action, asset recovery, termination of all 36 employees. Harold's failure required different accountability, not a courtroom, something else. I pulled out 2 sheets of paper, wrote legal action at the top of one, moral debt at the top of the other. Under legal action, prosecute Collin and co-conspirators for fraud. Terminate all 36 planted employees. Recover stolen assets. File criminal charges. Cooperate with law enforcement. Clear. Straightforward. The second list was harder. Under moral debt, Harold must formally compensate Inez directly for the partnership stake he stole in 1978. Calculate what 15% ownership from 1975 to today would be worth. Pay it publicly with full acknowledgement. Let the record show Inez Caldwell was a founding partner. Was I being fair to Harold? Was I enabling Collin's narrative by acknowledging the original debt? But the debt was real. The 1975 partnership agreement proved it. Inez had contributed capital, labor, expertise. Harold used legal technicalities to cheat her. Collin's fraud didn't erase Harold's theft. Harold's theft didn't justify Collin's fraud. Two separate crimes, two separate remedies. I could pursue both without excusing either. Looking at the employee roster, one name jumped out, Sarah Mendelson, purchasing coordinator. I'd hired her personally 2 years ago. Trusted her. She'd been stealing from me the entire time. The betrayal hit differently seeing her name among the 36. I focused on the two lists. Could this work? Prosecute fraud while forcing Harold to compensate Inez? Would the board see it as leadership or overreach? I didn't know. But staying silent, letting Harold's guilt and Collin's revenge keep bleeding the company wasn't an option. Dawn broke outside. I'd worked all night. I poured fresh coffee. 8 days until the board deadline. Meeting with the lawyer in 3 days, left 5 days after to implement whatever we devised. Barely enough time. I called Wanda. She answered on the third ring. Saskia, I need an emergency meeting 3 days from now. Can you make that work? What's this about? Complete fraud documentation. 6.2 million in systematic theft across 6 years. 36 co-conspirators. And I need your help designing something unprecedented. Unprecedented how? I looked at my two lists. I need to prosecute the fraud and force my father to compensate the victim he wronged 45 years ago, simultaneously. I don't know if there's legal precedent for addressing both a current crime and a historical injustice in the same action, but that's what I'm asking you to figure out. Wanda was quiet. You're serious. Completely. Can you research parallel civil restitution in family business fraud cases and prepare termination paperwork for 36 employees? 36. She paused. My God, yes, I'll clear my calendar. 3 days my office, 9 a.m. Perfect, thank you. I ended the call and stood in my kitchen, looking at the two handwritten lists on the table. Legal action and moral debt. Two paths I'd committed to walking simultaneously. No one in the company's 45-year history had tried this. Prosecute fraud while forcing the founder to face his own theft from decades earlier. Separate the crimes without excusing either. I set the pocket watch between the two lists and watched it tick. Harold had given me this watch, told me to keep the flame alive. But he'd never told me the flame was built on ashes of what he'd stolen. Now I had 3 days to figure out if justice could acknowledge both truths at once, and 5 days after that, to make the board believe I could lead a company through the most complicated moral reckoning it had ever faced. I spread 36 employee files across the conference table like a dealer laying out a rigged deck. 3 days had passed since I'd called Wanda. The company lawyer had spent 72 hours researching precedent, consulting colleagues, drafting preliminary legal frameworks. This morning, she'd delivered her verdict. My dual-track approach was legally viable, unprecedented, complex, potentially explosive, but viable. Now Wendy Harrington sat across from me, the fraud investigator who'd helped me trace every dollar of the theft, studying the files I'd arranged in careful rows. Wanda confirmed it can work, I said. We can prosecute the fraud and force Harold to make restitution to Inez's estate simultaneously. 2 separate legal actions, 1 moral framework. Wendy looked up. And the risks? If we pursue civil action for the historical debt, Inez's name becomes public record. Harold's betrayal becomes part of official company history. The press will have a field day. Respected steel company founder stole partnership stake from woman who helped him build empire. 45 years of silence already cost too much, I said. Keeping it quiet now just perpetuates what Harold did. Wendy nodded slowly. Then we do it your way. Both tracks. Full accountability. I paused mid-sentence, realizing I was about to dismantle everything my father built, and felt no hesitation. Help me organize this, I said. We need 2 clear categories. Evidence the board can't misunderstand. We spent the next hour sorting documents into 2 physical stacks. The first stack grew on the left side of the table. Direct fraud. Collin's 36 planted employees, complete with forged credentials and fake employment histories. Wire transfer records showing millions flowing to shell companies. Vendor contracts for services never rendered. Payroll manipulation across 3 departments. The systematic theft laid out in irrefutable detail. This stack destroys Collin, I said, placing the final document. Criminal prosecution, asset recovery, prison time. The second stack grew on the right. Historical debt. The 1975 partnership agreement showing Inez's $40,000 capital contribution and promised 15% equity stake. Harold's 1978 legal maneuvering that paid her $65,000 instead of the $200,000 she deserved. Documentation of company growth over 45 years. Calculation of what her stake would be worth today if Harold had honored his commitment. This stack forces Harold to finally pay what he owes, I said. Civil restitution, public acknowledgement, Inez Caldwell's name restored as founding partner. Wendax, you're prosecuting a crime and settling a conscience in the same boardroom. Because they're both real, I said, even if only one is criminal. One of the employee files fell open. Sarah Mendelssohn's photo stared up at me, the woman I'd hired personally, trusted completely, who'd been stealing from us the entire time. The betrayal felt visceral every time I saw her name. Wendy closed the file gently. We need to rehearse tomorrow's presentation. The board will have questions, hard ones. Walk me through it, I said. You'll present the fraud evidence first, Wendy said. Establish the criminal facts before introducing moral complexity. Show them the money trail, the planted employees, the systematic theft. Make it impossible to deny. I nodded. Then you explain the historical context, why Harold allowed it, the debt he owed to Inez, the guilt that paralyzed him for 6 years. Wendy met my eyes. The board will ask why you're mixing a criminal case with family history. Because ignoring the history is what enabled the crime, I said. Collin didn't wake up one day and decide to steal millions. He was born into a grievance his mother carried for 45 years. Harold's original theft created the conditions for Collin's revenge. They'll see it as weakness, Wendy warned. Acknowledging Harold wronged Inez gives Collin's defense ammunition. Or it shows I can hold both truths at once, I countered. Harold stole from Inez, that's real. Collin stole from Harold, that's also real. One doesn't excuse the other. Both require accountability. Wendy was quiet for a moment. You know this ends your father's chairmanship. Yes, probably his legacy too. When the story breaks, Harold Garrett won't be remembered as the man who built Garrett Steel. He'll be remembered as the man who stole it from his partner. That's the truth, I said quietly. He did steal it from his partner, and then he let her son steal it back, rather than face what he'd done. Both truths deserve to be known. How many companies survive when the founder's sins and the heir's crimes both demand payment on the same day? Harold won't survive this intact, Wendy said. I know. We rehearsed the presentation sequence twice more. I would lead. Wendy would handle board logistics, field questions about the investigative process, corroborate findings. We'd present the fraud prosecution and historical restitution as two necessary components of complete justice. 2 days until the board deadline. Tomorrow morning, everyone who mattered would be in that room, the full board, Harold, Collin, key department heads. No more private confrontations, no more silent knowing, everything exposed. You're sure about this? Wendy asked as we gathered the evidence. No, I admitted, but I'm certain staying silent is worse. I locked both stacks, direct fraud and historical debt, in my briefcase beside the pocket watch Harold had given me. Tomorrow morning, I'd walk into that boardroom carrying proof that would end two men's lives as they knew them. Wendy met my eyes across the table. Once you open that case, there's no going back. I know, I said. That's exactly why I have to open it. She left. I stayed in the conference room alone, briefcase locked, plan set, tomorrow looming like a cliff edge I'd chosen to walk toward. 45 years of silence, 6 years of theft, 2 crimes that had bled my family's company from different directions, enabled by the same instinct. Don't speak the truth if speaking costs too much. Tomorrow I'd prove that silence cost more. The boardroom went silent when I opened the briefcase and placed 36 employee files on the table like evidence at a trial. Everyone was there. Harold sat to my left, shoulders rigid, hands folded on the mahogany table. Collin sat across from him, expression unreadable. The board members who'd assembled for this emergency session, Frank Whitfield and 4 others, filled the remaining chairs. Wendy stood by the door, ready to distribute documentation, and in those 36 files lay proof of systematic theft spanning 6 years. Thank you for coming, I said. My voice was steady. What I'm about to show you represents the most comprehensive fraud investigation this company has ever faced. I spread the first set of files across the table. 36 employees, hired over the past 6 years across purchasing, logistics, payroll, and internal controls. Every single one has forged credentials, 0 legitimate work histories, all reporting, directly or indirectly, to Collin Caldwell. Frank leaned forward, picking up one of the files. Forged credentials? How is that possible? Because they were planted, I said. Systematically embedded in positions that allowed them to approve fraudulent invoices, manipulate payroll, and divert company assets. Together, they stole $6.2 million over 6 years. The number hung in the air. Harold's hand moved toward his vest pocket. The unconscious gesture he made when reaching for the pocket watch he'd carried for decades. But the watch wasn't there. I had it in my briefcase with the evidence. His hand dropped back to the table. Collin, Harold said, voice tight, tell me this isn't— You don't get to play shocked, old man, Collin interrupted. His voice was cold, contemptuous. You knew. From the first name I hired, don't insult everyone in this room by pretending otherwise. The board members stared. Mr. Caldwell, Frank said carefully, are you admitting— I'm saying Harold Garrett watched me build this network for 6 years, Collin said. Watched me hire people, approve contracts, move money, and he did nothing. Ask him why. All eyes turned to Harold. He sat frozen, face pale. I continued before anyone could derail the presentation. Wendy, distribute the documentation. Wendy moved around the table, placing thick folders in front of each board member. Payroll records, wire transfers, vendor contracts, the systematic theft laid out in irrefutable detail. Then the room erupted. Magnus Blanchard, who I'd hired 3 years ago as a regional procurement manager and thought competent until his credentials unraveled under audit, stood abruptly. I only took what Corbin told me was authorized. He said it was approved discretionary spending. You recruited 12 people, Corbin Delaney shot back. The logistics coordinator I'd confronted weeks ago looked panicked now, all smooth lies abandoned. I brought 4. You're the one who expanded. Both of you shut up, Collin said quietly. You both took the money. Own it. I watched Magnus and Corbin destroy each other and felt nothing, just cold satisfaction that truth burns, liars indiscriminately. Gentlemen, Frank tried to regain control. This is a formal board investigation. This is a witch hunt, Magnus said. Saskia is trying to cover for her father by... Cover for him? I cut him off. I'm the one who traced every dollar you stole, every fake employee, every fraudulent invoice. And yes, I traced the approvals too. Which brings us to the second part of this presentation. I pulled out the second stack of evidence. Harold Garrett didn't just watch this fraud happen. He enabled it, deliberately, for 6 years, because the conference room door opened. Wanda stood in the doorway, carrying an old personnel folder, yellowed edges, faded label that read 1975. Everyone stopped. Magnus mid-sentence. Corbin halfway out of his chair. Harold staring at the folder like it was a ghost. Wanda, Harold said, voice strained. This isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Wanda said quietly. She walked into the room, set the folder on the table in front of Harold. You asked me to research legal precedent for parallel civil restitution cases. I did. But while searching company archives, I found this. She opened the folder. Inside was a partnership agreement dated April 1975, signed by Harold Garrett and someone named Inez Caldwell. This folder should have been opened 45 years ago, Wanda said. What is that? Frank asked. Wanda looked at Harold. The original partnership agreement between Harold Garrett and Inez Caldwell, the woman who contributed capital and labor to found this company. The woman Harold pushed out in 1978 and paid a fraction of what she'd earned. The woman whose son, she glanced at Collin, is sitting in this room. The old folder in Wanda's hands looked thin, harmless, like a match that could burn down 45 years. Collin's mother, I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. Inez Caldwell helped Harold build Garrett Steel, invested $40,000, worked alongside him for 3 years, was promised 15% partnership equity, and in 1978, when their personal relationship ended, Harold used legal technicalities to pay her $65,000 instead of the $200,000 she deserved. Frank stared at Harold. Is this true? Harold said nothing. So when Collin showed up 6 years ago, I continued, Harold let him steal because Harold thought he deserved it, because he'd stolen from Inez first, because guilt paralyzed him into watching his own company bleed rather than face what he'd done decades ago. Every eye in the room shifted from the fraud evidence to the historical document. 2 crimes, 2 betrayals, 45 years apart, finally exposed in the same room. Wanda still stood holding the 1975 folder, staring at Harold. This is why the fraud went unchecked, she said quietly. This is the debt that enabled everything. The boardroom was absolutely silent, and I realized the second track of justice, Harold's debt to Inez, was about to become as public as Collin's crime. Wanda opened the folder and slid a single yellow document across the table toward Harold, a partnership agreement dated April 1975, signed by both Harold Garrett and Inez Caldwell. The boardroom stayed frozen, everyone staring at that faded paper like it might explode. Wanda's voice was quiet but clear. Partnership agreement between Harold Garrett and Inez Caldwell, dated April 12, 1975. Terms: Inez contributes capital and engineering expertise in exchange for 15% equity stake in Garrett Steel, effective immediately. She looked at Harold. 15% partnership. Her engineering work in exchange for equity, never fulfilled. I reached across the table, touched the document. The paper felt fragile under my fingers, edges soft with age. The signatures at the bottom were clear. Harold Garrett in bold blue ink, Inez Caldwell in careful script. 45 years old, real, legal, binding. My entire inheritance was built on my father's broken promise to another woman. "Dad," I said quietly, "is this real?" Harold didn't answer, just stared at the document like seeing it was worse than remembering it. 45 years, Collin said. His voice was rough. "She's still waiting, with nothing, while you built an empire on her designs, her capital, her labor. She spent her whole life knowing you stole from her and got away with it." "Mr. Caldwell," Frank started, "it doesn't excuse anything." Collin cut him off. "I stole. I know what I did, but don't pretend Harold's hands are clean. Don't pretend this company was built on his integrity alone." Harold stood slowly. The movement drew every eye. He looked older than his 70 years, shoulders bent, face lined with something heavier than age. "It's real," he said quietly. "The partnership agreement, the promise, all of it." The room waited. Inez Caldwell invested $40,000 in 1975. Harold continued. "More than that, she designed the fabrication process that won us our first major contracts, managed our books, negotiated deals I couldn't close. For 3 years, we built this company together." He touched the document with one finger, tracing the signatures. "When our personal relationship ended, she asked for her partnership share. Fair buyout based on company value. I used lawyers to minimize the payout. Claimed her investment was a loan, not equity. Paid her $65,000 when she deserved 10 times that." "Harold," Frank said, "why are you—" "Because my daughter just asked if it's real," Harold said, "and I'm done lying about it." He looked at me. "Everything you inherited, Saskia, this company, this reputation, this legacy, it was built on what I took from Inez. I've known that for 45 years. And when her son showed up 6 years ago, I thought," his voice broke slightly, "I thought letting him take from me was penance. Justice I deserved, but was too coward to face properly." Collin's face, when Harold admitted the debt, showed something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, something worse, vindication that his grievance was always real. "I knew about the fraud," Harold said. He was speaking to the whole room now, but his eyes stayed on me. "I stayed silent because I owed his mother a debt I never paid. I watched Collin embed his people, manipulate payroll, steal millions. And I did nothing because I thought I deserved it." The admission hung in the air like smoke. "That was wrong," Harold continued. "Collin's theft was criminal. My silence was cowardice. They're both real, both wrong, and both debts come due today." He turned to face Collin directly. "I will compensate you," Harold said, "for what your mother should have received. 15% of company value from 1975 to today, calculated fairly, publicly acknowledged, her name restored as a founding partner in all company records." Harold's voice hardened slightly. "And then you will face prosecution for what you stole, because your mother's legitimate claim doesn't make your fraud legal. It makes my guilt older, but both crimes are real." The boardroom was absolutely silent. I watched my father stand there, finally choosing honesty over legacy, 45 years too late. And something in my chest cracked open. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just recognition that this was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harold's admission landed like a foundation stone, settling heavy, final, holding everything else in place. "The board will need to vote," Frank said slowly, "on the compensation, on the prosecution, on all of this." "The board will vote," Harold agreed, But my admission stands regardless. I stole from Inez Caldwell. I enabled theft by staying silent. Both are true. Both require accountability. He sat down heavily. Collin stared at him across the table. I couldn't read the expression on my half-brother's face. Rage, respect, grief that his mother had waited 45 years to see this moment, maybe all three. The room stayed silent. No one seemed to know what to say when a man admits to stealing a company from his partner and then admits to watching his company be stolen as penance. Wanda gathered the 1975 document carefully, placed it back in the folder. I'll need this for the legal proceedings, both the civil restitution and the criminal prosecution. Both, Harold confirmed, not one or the other, both. I looked at my father, the man who'd built everything I knew, who'd given me the pocket watch and told me to keep the flame alive, who'd finally admitted that flame was lit with someone else's match. Not the founder I'd idolized, not the man I'd thought I knew, just a man who'd made terrible choices and was finally, decades late, trying to make them right. The question, Frank said quietly, is whether this company survives the truth. The question, I corrected, is whether this company deserves to survive if the truth destroys it. I met Harold's eyes across the table. We're going to find out. The woman sitting across from me looked nothing like the victim I'd imagined. Inez Caldwell, 71 years old, held herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd spent 45 years knowing she was right. Ms. Garrett, she said, extending a slim hand, thank you for meeting me here. The coffee shop in West Des Moines was modest, far from the legal battlegrounds where this should have unfolded. I'd expected bitterness, recrimination, the kind of righteous fury I'd seen in Dad's eyes when he confessed. Instead, Inez Caldwell radiated something closer to relief. I wasn't sure you'd want to meet, I admitted. She smiled faintly. Your father's daughter. You look like him, you know, around the eyes. The observation should have felt invasive. Instead, it landed like absolution. She'd known Dad when he was young, before the guilt carved lines into his face, before silence became his default language. I need you to understand something, Inez said, her coffee untouched between us. I never wanted revenge. That was Collin's fire, not mine. The twist hit me harder than any courtroom revelation. But he stole from you, 15%. He stole from both of us, she corrected gently. From Collin and from me. And yes, it was wrong, but Collin turned that wrong into a crusade. He needed an enemy more than he needed justice. I thought of Dad's slow unraveling, the decades of guilt that had metastasized into silence. Dad knew. He knew what he owed you, and he stayed silent because he was ashamed, Inez finished. I know. Collin told me everything. The partnership Harold promised me, then took back with lawyers and loopholes. Harold had every reason to face what he'd done, and 45 years to avoid it. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. This woman, this stranger, who should have despised our entire family, was offering Dad an understanding I wasn't sure he deserved. But that doesn't make it right, I said. Her eyes, pale blue and unwavering, met mine. No, it doesn't, but it makes it human. Outside the window, a young father chased his laughing daughter across the parking lot. Simple joy, uncomplicated by decades of buried secrets. I wondered if Dad and Collin had ever been that easy with each other. The forensic accountants calculated the value, I said, pulling out the folder Wanda Townsend had prepared. 15% of Garrett Steel from 1975 to 2020. They arrived at $2.8 million. Inez's hand trembled slightly as she accepted the papers. Not from shock, she'd clearly known this day would come, but from something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, acknowledgement. I didn't ask for this, she said quietly. I know. But Dad wants to give it. He needs to. She studied the compensation agreement, her reading glasses perched on her nose, the silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the espresso machine and the murmur of other patrons whose lives contained no courtroom dramas, no 45-year-old debts. Will this fix him? Inez asked finally. The question landed like a diagnosis. Could money repair a man who'd built his entire moral architecture on justified silence? Could acknowledgement undo decades of complicity? I don't know, I admitted, but it's a start. Inez nodded slowly. Then let's finish it. The lawyer's office was downtown, all glass and steel and expensive minimalism. Wanda had arranged everything with her characteristic precision. 3 copies of the agreement, notary standing by, the check already cut from the company's settlement fund. Dad arrived alone. No board members, just him in a suit that hung slightly loose, as if the confession had physically diminished him. Inez, he said, and his voice cracked on her name. Harold. They didn't embrace. The distance between them contained too much history for casual gestures. Instead, they sat across the polished conference table while Wanda walked them through the terms. This agreement constitutes full compensation for the 15% partnership stake promised to Inez Caldwell by Harold Garrett in 1975, Wanda recited. Payment of $2.8 million plus a formal acknowledgement that Ms. Caldwell was wrongfully excluded from partnership benefits. Dad's hand shook as he signed. Not the tremor of age, but the physical manifestation of burden lifting. 3 signatures his, Inez's, the notary's, and 45 years of debt became history instead of haunting. Inez accepted the check with both hands, treating it like something fragile. This doesn't erase what happened, she said. I know, Dad replied. But it's honest, finally. Hia nodded, eyes bright with tears he wouldn't let fall. Thank you for giving me the chance to do what's right. But it was what he said to me afterward, in the elevator down, that I'd remember. Thank you for making me do what's right. The distinction mattered. Inez had allowed it. I had forced it. And somewhere in that difference lay the truth about who we all were. The elevator descended 43 floors. I counted every one, trying to measure the distance between justice and redemption. The numbers didn't add up. The check would clear. Inez would disappear back into her quiet life. And Dad would face the fraud prosecution, knowing he'd finally acknowledged one of the many debts our family had incurred. But as I watched him walk toward his car, shoulders straighter than I'd seen in weeks, I realized we'd only settled the historical account. The current crisis, the fraud, the investigation, the media circus still waited with teeth bared. My phone buzzed. A text from Wanda. DA confirms criminal referrals moving forward against Collin's network. Meeting tomorrow to finalize the list. Dad didn't know yet. He was still savoring this one moment of moral clarity before the next impossible choice arrived. I let him have it. God knows he'd earned 30 seconds of peace. I handed Magnus Blanchard his termination letter first, not because his crime was worst, but because he'd lied the longest when given chance to cooperate. The DA's confirmation had arrived the night before. Criminal referrals moving forward against the core conspirators. But that alone wouldn't fix what Collin had planted inside Garrett Steele. That required surgery. You recruited 12 people, I said, sliding the letter across the conference table, then blamed Corbin when caught. Criminal referral, no recommendation. Magnus went ash gray. Collin orchestrated everything. We were just following orders. You had 3 chances to cooperate. You chose lies every time. Corbin Delaney sat beside him, silent after months of defiance. His termination letter was identical, immediate dismissal, full criminal referral. 2 men who'd built complicity on recruiting others, discovering that loyalty to fraud bought nothing. Security will escort you out, I said. They left without ceremony. No protests, no appeals, just two men who'd gambled on silence and lost. Wanda Townsend stood by the door, folders thick enough to represent 34 more lives about to change. The cooperators? She asked. Termination, without criminal referral, I confirmed. 17 total. Those 17 had come forward early, admitted participation before confrontation forced it. They'd been desperate. Collin had been persuasive. They'd made terrible choices. But when given the chance, they'd chosen truth. The calculus was brutal but necessary. Cooperation earned mercy. Deception earned prosecution. Of the 36 planted employees, only 4 had real credentials. The rest were pure fiction, names on paychecks cashing checks for 18 months. The remaining 19 occupied moral middle ground, that gray space between lying and eventual honesty. They'd stayed silent until confronted, confessed only when evidence made denial impossible. Their letters came with criminal referrals attached. Will the DA prosecute all 19? Wanda asked. That's their choice, I said. Ours was proportional justice. By noon, 36 employment files had been closed. Criminal referrals filed for 21, and Garrett Steel had hemorrhaged 8% of its workforce. The factory floor looked gutted, shifts scrambled, production delayed. But the rot was gone. Now came the hard part. I found Collin on the factory grounds near the loading dock, watching forklifts move pallets with mechanical precision he'd exploited for months. He didn't turn when I approached, just kept his eyes on the choreography of honest work. They're gone, I said, all 36. Quick surgery. I pulled out the final folder. Your mother received her compensation, $2.8 million. Harold signed it himself. Something shifted in Collin's expression, not quite relief, but close. The faintest loosening of tension. Your mother's grievance was real, I continued. Your fraud was criminal. I can separate those two things. Tenyu? Genuine curiosity, not challenge. I watched his face. When I mentioned the compensation, saw something like relief beneath the anger, proof he'd always wanted acknowledgement more than revenge. Here's what I'm offering, I said. Resign immediately. Make partial restitution over 10 years, half of what the fraud cost us. No criminal prosecution. He turned fully toward me, studying my face, looking for the lie beneath the offer. Why? Because your mother deserved what she got today. Because you weaponized a legitimate grievance into something criminal. And because I won't make my father's mistake of treating complexity like it's simple. Collin was quiet, factory noise filling the space between us. Somewhere distant, a truck horn blared. Normal operations, continuing despite the chaos. So I pay back half, walk away, and you don't prosecute. Yes. And Harold, what does he think? This isn't his choice, I said. It's mine. He stayed silent for 45 years because guilt made him choose loyalty over justice. I'm choosing something different. The distinction landed. Collin's shoulders dropped, fight draining, not from defeat, but from recognition. I'll sign, he said finally. Wanda had the resignation agreement ready in her car, terms drafted with the same precision she'd applied to Inez's compensation. Collin read every line, asked 2 clarifying questions, then signed with practiced efficiency. When it was done, he handed me the pen. At least this time, you told me the truth. The words hit harder than any accusation. Not gratitude, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that transparency changed the moral weight of consequences. Harold had hidden behind justified anger and punished through silence. I'd explained exactly why Collin was being held accountable and exactly why mercy was possible. Same outcome, different foundation. Collin's acceptance felt like watching a knot finally loosen. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but the end of a 45-year tangle neither of us created. I watched him walk toward the parking lot, carrying nothing but the folder with his resignation terms. He didn't look back, didn't wave, just disappeared into the afternoon light while behind us the factory kept running. The fraud was resolved. Magnus and Corbin faced prosecution. 17 cooperators faced unemployment. 19 fence-sitters faced both. And Collin, my half-brother, my antagonist, the man who'd nearly destroyed everything, walked away with consequences that acknowledged both his crime and the wound that had caused it. But the company, Harold built on broken promises and justified silence, still stood, gutted and bleeding, waiting for someone to rebuild it on a foundation that could actually hold weight. That someone, apparently, was me. The board vote was unanimous, 7-0, making me president of the company my father built on a broken promise 45 years ago. 10 days had passed since Collin walked away carrying his resignation agreement. 10 days of emergency staffing and explaining to shell-shocked employees why 36 coworkers had vanished overnight. The company was still standing, gutted and bleeding, but ready to rebuild on something more solid than silence. The succession ceremony happened on the factory floor, not in a boardroom. Harold's idea, and I'd agreed. If we were doing this, the people who actually made Garrett Steel run deserved to witness it. 300 employees gathered in the main assembly area. Production halted for the first time in company history for something other than emergency or holiday. Harold and I stood on a makeshift platform near quality control. Harold looked smaller, his suit hanging loose, not diminished by age but by honesty, as if confession had physically extracted the weight he'd carried. I built this company on silence, he said, his voice carrying through borrowed speakers, on secrets I told myself were justified, on loyalty that became complicity. My daughter rebuilt it on truth. No preamble, no soft introduction. Just raw acknowledgement that the founder they'd trusted had failed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Saskia did what I couldn't, Harold continued. She told the truth even when it cost everything. She held people accountable while acknowledging their wounds. She showed me that leadership isn't perfection, it's transparency. I felt the weight of the pocket watch in his hand before he offered it heavier than metal and mechanism, carrying 45 years of silence I was choosing not to inherit. Harold extended the watch, that brass timepiece I'd seen him wind 1,000 times. The gesture was formal, ceremonial, a transfer of authority everyone understood. "Keep the flame," he said quietly, amplified by the microphone. "Not the way I kept it, the way you already have." I accepted the watch, feeling its weight settle into my palm, warm from his pocket, ticking steady. "I'll lead differently," I said, my voice steady, "but I'll lead." The applause started in shipping Derek Moss and his team and spread through the crowd. Not enthusiastic, not celebratory, just acknowledgement. They'd seen what transparency cost, and they were willing to see what it could build. Harold stepped down from the platform, disappearing into the crowd with a nod. He'd passed the rest of his days as majority shareholder, board member emeritus, the founder whose legacy would always be complicated by truth. Production resumed 15 minutes later. Orders still needed filling, customers still needed serving, but the foundation had changed. That evening, alone in my new office, Harold's old office, cleared of his photos, I sat at the desk and held the pocket watch up to the light. The brass caught the last rays of sunset, casting small reflections on the wall. I'd spent weeks chasing fraud, confronting betrayal, distributing consequences. I'd met my half-brother, watched my father confess, separated legitimate grievance from criminal action. And now I held the symbol of leadership Dad had carried for 43 years. The watch ticked in my palm, steady and certain. It didn't care that Collin had committed fraud from real wounds, didn't care that Harold had stayed silent from complicated loyalty, didn't care that Inez had waited 45 years for acknowledgement she deserved immediately. Time just moved forward, indifferent to our justifications. Is it victory when you inherit a company by exposing its founder's betrayal, or just the complicated truth of what leadership actually costs? I thought about what I'd learned in 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. That people you trust can fail without being evil. That justice can acknowledge both crime and wound without excusing either. That complexity isn't an excuse for inaction, it's a requirement for honest judgment. That keeping the flame doesn't mean protecting legacy from truth. The realization settled over me like something I'd always known but never articulated. Harold had carried this watch as a shield, proof of continuity and tradition. He'd kept the flame by hiding it from wind that might extinguish it. But flames don't survive in vacuum. They need air, even if that air sometimes threatens them. I'd keep the flame differently, by acknowledging what Collin built on broken promises, by compensating Inez for decades of exclusion, by holding Magnus and Corbin accountable while showing mercy to cooperators, by explaining my decisions instead of hiding behind authority, by leading with transparency. Dad never practiced, accepting complexity he'd always avoided, telling truth even when it cost everything. The fraud was resolved, the historical debt paid, the succession complete. And I finally understood what keeping the flame meant. The pocket watch ticked steady on my desk time moving forward, not erasing past, but refusing to stay trapped in it. I wound the watch carefully, feeling the familiar resistance of the spring mechanism, then set it on the desk where anyone entering would see it. Not hidden in a drawer, not locked away with secrets, visible. A reminder that legacy means carrying forward both achievements and accountability, that leadership requires transparency instead of silence, complexity instead of certainty, truth even when it costs everything. Outside my window, the factory lights burned against the gathering darkness. 300 employees working evening shift, filling orders, maintaining quality, building products that had sustained Garrett Steel through 4 decades. They deserved better than secrets, better than justified silence, better than a founder who'd chosen loyalty over justice and called it keeping the flame. They deserved a leader who understood that honest foundation, however flawed and painful to build, was the only kind that could hold real weight. I pressed my palm flat against the desk, feeling the solid wood. This was mine now, the company, the legacy, the flame. And I knew exactly how I was going to keep it. For years, I trusted the foundation my father built without questioning what it stood on. I assumed silence meant strength, that protecting family meant hiding their mistakes. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until fraud, lies, and decades of buried secrets force you to choose between truth and comfort. Ask the hard questions before crisis makes them unavoidable. Transparency isn't cruelty, it's the only foundation that holds real weight. This wasn't a revenge story, though it could have been. My half-brother sought revenge for what was stolen from his mother 45 years ago. I could have pursued revenge against my father for his complicity. But revenge story endings rarely bring peace. Instead, I learned that justice can acknowledge both crime and wound without excusing either. I believe God put me through this to show me that complexity isn't an excuse for inaction. It's a requirement for honest judgment. People you trust can fail without being evil, and keeping the flame means carrying both achievements and accountability. If this story made you think about your own family dynamics, your own buried truths, drop a comment and tell me what stood out most to you. Did I make the right choice? Would you have handled it differently? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about navigating impossible family situations, subscribe to Secrets Her Kept. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means everything to me. One last reminder, while certain details have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection, the lesson at the heart of this story is real, and I hope it stays with you.